Great. Well, we'll get going. Delighted that you can join us for a session on managing the risks of the remote workforce. I'm Sally from CRF, and I'm also delighted to introduce your host, Caroline Smith, Deputy General Counsel at HireRight. Before I invite Caroline to the stage, a couple of quick housekeeping points. If you would like to share your thoughts or ask a question, please type them in the comments box. Or you've got the option of raising your hand. You see a button, the raise hand button, and you can ask a question or make a point. So we really encourage both to keep it interactive. Our aim is that we are able to keep the conversations going after the session. And in addition, we'll ask Caroline to share any supplementary information which might be useful, depending on what emerges from today's session. If you don't want to receive this, please drop me an email at sally@crforum.co.uk or drop me a message in the private chat. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our session leader, Caroline, for the next 40 minutes. Welcome, Caroline.
Hi, thank you, Sally, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today in our masterclass for managing the risks of a remote workforce. I have to say, at one point earlier today, I was considering changing this to managing the risks of providing a virtual conference seminar. I kind of feel slightly like I'm a character in Tron, if anyone can remember that movie, where we're sort of slightly lost in a virtual world. So yes, all very stressful. So I've been introduced. I'm Deputy General Counsel for HireRight, and I look after our international business. If we move on to the next slide, we'll just do a very quick intro about HireRight, and kind of, this isn't to sort of talk too much about HireRight, but we're the premier global background screening and workforce solutions provider, which may not necessarily tailor so much to sort of what we're going to talk about today. But essentially what we do is we provide a service whereby we're helping our customers in various sector verticals to onboard their candidates and to manage the risk of that onboarding by verifying information that those individuals provide about themselves, be that their sort of work or education background or other items. And when this whole kind of, saga of 2020 started, we really started to look at how our services could potentially help and assist our customers in managing any risks that might be associated with COVID-19 and workforces. And in order to do that, we actually as a team started to come together and really think about what the risks would be in terms of managing a remote workforce. And that's really how we've kind of got here today, was really through those discussions, and we found them quite interesting. So hopefully you'll find them interesting as well. I'm obviously a lawyer. I'm not going to bore you to death with legalese and lots of quotes about the GDPR. I might bore you, but hopefully not about the law. This is meant to be sort of slightly sort of higher level and just generally discussing the risks. What we're going to be doing throughout this, there'll be a couple of polls that we'll ask you to participate in. And then sort of the last portion of this, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how we run with time, we'll be asking the tables to break out, and we've got a little scenario for you to discuss. And then hopefully if we've got time, we can chat about that sort of more as a group. So moving on to our next slide. $2020. I mean, that's kind of like big pause there, really upping the ante. 2020, the story so far. Well, I'm not sure whether it's a tragedy a la Steps or whether it's a tragicomedy based off the Shakespearean genre, but it's certainly not the year we all thought that we would have. I think we all sort of toasted 2020, the new decade. There was lots of talk in the press about the roaring 20s. And it's been really more of a sort of feral, out of control tiger roaring at us rather than roaring 20s and it all being fun. No one could have predicted what was happening this year. It's an incredibly topsy-turvy world that we live in at the moment. If I think back to March when we were all locked up, we were all in lockdown, you could hear birdsong in central London. We had good weather for once, which is ironic because none of us could go outside to enjoy it. Liverpool, after 30 years in the doldrums, finally regained their Premier League title and rediscovered their glory days from the 1980s. And if nothing else illustrates how topsy-turvy the world is, last week they were beaten 7-2 by Aston Villa. So, if you can go from the dizzy heights of winning the Premier League to I think it was the biggest defeat that any Premier League side's ever encountered. So that's fun. So, all in all, it's been a little bit of a weird year. And when we first started to prepare this, we actually had our meeting in the office. We'd all gone back into the office. We're wearing our masks, socially distanced, and we worried that this was going to be a little bit of a passé topic and everyone would be bored and we'd all be sort of living our lives a little bit more normally. Roll on a couple of weeks from that meeting and suddenly we became super relevant again because all the rules changed. And I'm sure many of you today are actually looking at your phones and seeing what the updates are going to be and are waiting with bated breath for Boris's 50,000th address to the nation about what's going to happen later on today with our tiered lockdowns. So, the landscape has changed. We have all overnight gone from working in offices to working from home where we can. And for most of us that have office-based roles, that means most of us are working from home. And that's pretty different. And as I said, when we started to think about our services, one of the things we thought about was, well, is there a bigger risk? We're kind of imagining there's a bigger risk here with everybody working from home, but is there one? So if we move on to the next slide, this is kind of the results of our sort of thought process. So I think maybe there's some bullet points on here that are flowing through. So if we can get all the bullet points up, that would be great, but I will carry on. There we go. I will carry on talking. So there's additional risks that are associated with remote working. And we tried to figure out, why are there additional risks? And one of the things that, I think most of us who commute in and out of London or commute any distance during the day, we've dreamt of an idyllic world where we no longer have to commute and that, we can all work from home. But actually, on reflection, most of us have a different work personality to our home personalities. There's obviously crossover, but our workplace is a very defined space, and that act of commuting into work, stepping into your defined office space and then coming home again is a sort of unique and distinct piece from our sort of home lives. And with our remote working, we've lost that. We've lost all of those things that denote that we are now at work. And I think whether we're aware of it or not, we actually do behave differently at work. We're more aware of work-related risks. Whereas at home, the old adage of, our homes are our castles. This is a place that we come to retreat. Work doesn't normally intrude so much into our day-to-day lives. And this is a safe space. We're more relaxed. We're not sort of constantly thinking about danger necessarily. And when, we don't approach risk in the same way, especially when we're working. So we've ended up sort of working in our home environments where we are, instinctively much more relaxed. As opposed to sort of, our work environments where we have many, many visual cues all through the day and colleagues that are, holding us to account, talking about what our core values are, etc. So the very fact that we're actually now working from home just redefines our space. And it takes a lot of adaptation to actually move into that space and suddenly see it as a purely workspace. And you can see, for example, from my background, I'm not in, an office. I'm kind of in my living room. So, I don't have, again, that little defined space in which I exist and work. I just kind of exist, as it were. So what does that in and of itself do? Well, there's a couple of things that sort of really sprung to our minds, and they were changes of culture, but also financial pressures. So if we look at changes in culture, well, culture in some respects has been slightly eroded by working from home. When we had the initial lockdown period, we were all getting on Teams calls, we were having, Zoom cocktails, lots of interaction, trying to keep everyone's spirits up. We all thought this was going to be for a few weeks, not a few months. That, to a certain extent, as things have transitioned into a more, into a new normal, overused phrase, but still quite useful phrase. As we've transitioned, those types of things have sort of fallen away a little bit. But what has always been the case from day one is that we're no longer surrounded physically by our colleagues. And as I say, I think probably you don't realise that actually your colleagues, we do modify our behaviours around our colleagues. We do think about what we say. We think about how we behave. And so we don't have that anymore. We're far more isolated. We don't feel as part of a big team as perhaps we did before. It's very difficult to recreate that. It's very difficult to recreate those sort of homogenous kind of goals that everybody is striving towards. Things like, your core values, in our office, for example, we've got our core 4 values are kind of pasted up on the walls here and there. I did think about putting them in my home space to remind me, but our branded colours don't go with my living room, so I haven't. So we have, there's a real difference in terms of, sort of not having those visual cues. And, we don't have all of our, daily reminders. It's less easy to pop into somebody's office and sort of talk about an issue and a problem or something that maybe you've observed from somebody's behaviour. All of those things have gone because you actually can't see somebody's behaviour. So culturally, we've really adjusted. There's a real change to office culture. It doesn't really exist in this sphere, and it's very, very difficult to replicate. Something else that I think that sort of, is hidden and perhaps, pre-working from home, whilst financial pressures are always going to be prevalent in most people's lives. Again, the fact that you're walking into an office, most of us try and leave our sort of personal problems at the door. Well, we don't have that anymore. We're living with them daily. We're not moving very far from sort of our sofas or our sort of problems. So we're in the same space. So, any issues, any pressures that you have, financial or otherwise, are going to feel slightly more on top of you, and you're less able to disassociate yourself. With nobody around you, it's obviously going to be more tempting to give into those pressures as well if you do find yourself in that situation. And I think really importantly, again, in the office, this is a defined space that you are operating in with a defined set of people. When we're working from home, whether we're sharing accommodation with our families, or we are in, as if we're younger or just we want to, we could be sharing accommodation with people who are not part of our families. So you could be in a flat share, for example, or a house share. So you have people that wouldn't normally be a risk to your business suddenly in your office space because everybody's space is now merged together. Now, you may be fine, you may not have any of these financial pressures, but those people around you may well do. And those risks you can't see, you can't pick up on those in a Teams call or any of the things we're trying to do to all keep connected. But they do exist. It's sort of a threat that we can't see. And again, it comes about because our workspace and our home space has merged. So we're going to go to our first poll, if we can. Let me see if we can do this. If it works, if it doesn't, we'll ditch the polls. I think it's going to work. We are going to ask you, if the polls are going to come up, whether or not you have reviewed and updated your information security training to account for your workforce being remote. Ooh. I've just come out of the poll. So if you could vote now, that would be fantastic. Right, well, I don't really think that I need to keep this one open. That's a resounding no. Oh no, hang on. Oh, we've got some change now. Again, it's like COVID-19, isn't it? It's all up and down. Super. Okay, so we'll close the poll at this point. And I think that was actually quite a resounding no. So if we can go back to the slides. That's interesting, and I'd say that aligns with our experience as well, which is that, when we first went into lockdown, about 2 weeks after that, we actually had our information security training. And when I looked at that, what really struck me was that those information security trainings that we give to all of our staff and that everybody has to pass actually relate very much to being in the workspace, not working from home. And so, you know, one of the things that sort of we'd thought about just from an internal perspective is actually looking at those information security policies and trainings and actually updating them. So, you know, again, we talk about our behaviours in the office instinctively, in theory. When you move to your printer, or you take a break, go for your lunch, or, you know, you go and make a coffee, you'll do Control-Alt-Delete on your computer. How many of us are actually doing that? Okay, if you live on your own, it doesn't matter. But how many of us are really doing that in the day if we're moving away from our desks to do any of those things? Or you may not have a printer, but, you know, go and get your lunch, make a coffee, stop and have a chat with a roommate, all of those types of things. You may not be doing Control-Alt-Delete. You know, if you nip out to the corner shop to get some milk, you're not going to let a stranger into your house. You'd hopefully be aware if there's someone you didn't know in your house. However, if you're in a shared house, you might not know if the person that's lurking around is a friend of your flatmates, or in fact has just sort of managed to get into the flat or not. But, you know, how many of us, when we nip out, don't double, triple lock our doors, all of those types of things. I was actually visited at the weekend by the Met Police handing out some Met Trace stuff. There's been a huge explosion of crime, surprisingly enough, in the London area due to COVID-19 and just people lurking around and turning to a life of crime, I assume. And so they're trying to get people to mark all of their valuables with this kind of invisible ink. You know, I've never seen that before. It's been a program that's been in place for 5 years. But again, there are those pressures, there are those changes that we're seeing. So again, if you nip out, you lock the door. If you live in shared accommodation, you know, be vigilant about who's lurking around the flat. If you don't recognise them, ask them questions in the same way you would if a random visitor, you know, came into your office space. So there's things that we can do with our information security policies or information security training to really tailor them to our current and really unique situations, just to remind people and iterate that those things that are in place in the office are actually equally valid when you're at home, slightly adapted, but equally valid. You know, let's look at data security and access to sensitive company information. You know, one of the things that I was asked quite early on was, does the GDPR, and I did promise not too much legal chat, so this will be one of the very few mentions I make of it, but does the GDPR in and of itself stop people from working from home? And the short answer is no. EU law is always going to be sort of very principles based. It's not you can do A, you can't do B. So provided you've got your technical and security measures in place, you're absolutely fine. But what you might want to do from a data security perspective is re-review who you're classing as a high-risk individual within your organisation. Roles that traditionally might not be deemed to be such whilst you're in that office environment may end up being higher risk due to them working from home, or potentially their own home lives. And we'll get onto that when we talk a little bit about screening and how it can potentially help. And then access to sensitive company information. We're going to go to another poll. And the question this time, if you could answer, is, have you reviewed file access within your organisation since COVID-19 came upon us and we all started to work from home? So if everyone could answer that, that would be fabulous. We'll just let it settle. Okie dokie. And then that's pretty settled. So we'll close the poll there. Again, the no's, I think, have it. And there's a pretty even split between yeses and not sure. So I think in general, sort of with not sure and no, we're looking more at no. So if we kind of go back to our slides, one of the things that we've been, you know, that we think about is sort of the data that you have to have access to when you're actually doing your job. So if I ever have a new team member join me, our IT team are always asking, you know, whose access rights do we replicate? And the starting assumption is always mine. But of course, with my role, I have access to a lot of information that perhaps a junior person in my team wouldn't, despite the fact that they're legally trained and qualified. So there's always a review of what does somebody really need to have access to in order to actually perform their job successfully. So again, one of the things that we might want to look at as we have this continued situation of working from home is access to that sensitive company information. So if we move on to the next slides. This is kind of where screening comes in. So we're going to actually go straight to a poll, which is very exciting. So
Hi there, we seem to have lost Caroline. I'm just trying to look at what's going on, and hi Caroline, no, we can't hear you. I'm assuming PSA are there on it trying to get you back, Caroline. Can you hear me, Caroline?
If you bear with us, I've asked her to refresh her screen, so hopefully she will pop back up.
Okay, thanks, Craig. Sorry about this. I guess it wouldn't be a digital conference without some interruptions, but hopefully we will get Caroline back soon when she's refreshed her browser.
okay, can people see and hear me now? Cool. I don't know where I went, but I went. Like I say, this is just like being in Tron. This is my biggest fear since I was about 12. This is terrible.
Okay, yeah, we can hear you perfectly, Caroline. Back over to you now.
Super, thank you. Wonderful. So we were going to go to a poll, which I think is what crashed my screen. So have you had a screening policy in place for longer than 3 years? So if everyone could vote, that would be super. Brilliant. So that's settled down quite well. So actually most of you have, or there's quite a few not sures, but I think the majority here is yes, you have had a screening policy in place for longer than 3 years. And I'm going to move straight into the second poll question, which is, do you have employee rescreening in place? If you know. So if we could have the poll up for that one, that would be great. So if you could all vote now. So that's a real 50-50 split if we're not going to have any change. Oh, we've got some changes. So actually we've gone more to the no's here. So again, just in the interest of time, sorry everyone, we'll just close this poll. So the reasons that we wanted to ask those questions were, if we sort of go back to the slides, is that, you know, we often come across organisations that have never screened before, which means that, you know, you could have quite a number of your folk in your organisation that have just genuinely never been screened, either, you know, not screened by your own organisation, or in fact never screened during the duration of their career, and you don't necessarily know so much about their background. So creating sort of fictional persona, you could have somebody working in your finance team and they've been with you for, say, I don't know, 15 years. You know, they have access to invoicing, et cetera, but what you don't know is that 16 years ago, they actually had a conviction for fraud, and it's an unspent conviction. But you don't know that. And now we're in sort of this time period where people are obviously undergoing more stresses and strains from a financial perspective. And we'll revisit the sort of fictional finance person in a moment. When we look at rescreening, for example, you know, certain roles expected. A lot of you who work in financial services will obviously have to conduct the rescreening for your senior manager certification regime. But rescreening, you know, as it says here, it has to be dealt with sensitively, and there are cultural issues around all of this. But one of the things that we thought about with things like rescreening and also screening is it's not intended to be a sword that the employer wields against its employees. We're thinking of it more as a type of shield for the employees. So what would screening do, either when you onboard people or if they are existing employees and you wanted to rescreen them? So the biggest thing that it will allow you to do is to monitor them. You've got all sorts of IT activity that you can use and IT programs where you can do employee monitoring. But also behavior is obviously a little bit more difficult to monitor. So if you are doing a rescreening program or want to roll out a rescreening program, it can actually help if you choose the right type of product sets on all of that non-static data. It can actually help you monitor changes to that behavior, changes that could be important to you. And those could drive you to take certain actions. So let's revisit this finance person. You decide you're going to rescreen everybody in your finance team. And actually what turns up is that over the last 12 months, that individual's credit rating or that their credit report has come back with quite a lot of negative information, and it's been getting steadily worse. Now that individual obviously at that point has to be has to be considered as a relatively high risk individual in a particular role, because they've got access to financial information. So what are the things you can do? You're certainly not going to want to just, pick them out. But things that you can do is review your access. So does that person over the years, have they ended up with more access to information than perhaps they really need to have to sort of do their job successfully? Is there refresher training that can be done? Can you re-roll out things like your information security or data security, confidentiality training as just a refresh, just to keep everybody on top of things? You might want to think about pastoral care. That individual is likely going through some quite difficult times at the moment, exacerbated potentially by things that are going on that you have no visibility to, that will be pressurizing them by the fact that they're actually not working in an office, they're working at home. So those pressures are there all the time. So pastoral care, having an avenue for people to actually discuss any issues that are coming up, would be something that could be quite powerful for that individual and help them feel supported. And then actually all of those things together can actually help to mitigate your risks. You're not having to take any action against that employee, but you are of course taking care of them and taking care of your risk. So for example, again, pastoral care could include something like looking at their holiday allocation. I don't know how many people are trying to bank all their holidays at the moment, but everybody needs a break. Just because we're not commuting doesn't mean we don't need breaks. So try and get that person out for a couple of weeks on their holiday or a week on their holiday, maybe change your HR policies so that people have to mandatorily take a week's leave before the end of the year. You could then monitor some of the work that they were doing without them necessarily being too aware of it. And again, help to manage your risk in that way. One of the big things is, well, does GDPR prevent us from doing all of this? And the answer to that, again, is no. There are multiple reasons why you can process data. So you have to think about whether it's relevant and proportionate to the role of the person and the risks that you're currently encountering as a business. So we're going to go to the final poll of this slide and then talk a tiny bit more about this. If we could just go to poll number, I'm not sure which number it is, but anyway, that doesn't matter. So the question is, has COVID-19 made screening or rescreening more palatable or necessary in your business? So if you could all vote now. Okay, so I think it's an overwhelming no and not sure if we can close that poll down now. We've got a few people, about 20% think yes. If we can go back to the slides. But the majority are saying no or they're not sure. There's kind of almost an even split between those two. And I think actually it's interesting, if we look at the legislation as being a positive thing, it actually does enable us, if used in the right way, to actually look at our candidates or our employees a little bit more. So provided the processing you're doing is legitimate, relevant and proportionate to the risks and the roles of those individuals, there's an argument that actually rescreening or screening those individuals on arrival into the organisation or for the duration of their tenure actually is something that can be done regardless of where you may be hiring around the world. And there's things that you can do to make that process less intrusive. So one thing that you could potentially do is think about, as opposed to kind of I'm doing a criminal check on you, which can feel a little bit aggressive, you could do some sort of question-based rescreening. So you can do some general public information, media type searches, but you could also start to introduce additional questions that pre-COVID potentially weren't relevant, but post-COVID potentially now are. So you're not going to ask a question of, do you live with other people? That's a little bit nosy. But what you could do is introduce a question in your screening that talks about, do you live with or cohabit with an individual who works at a competitor company? Now, the answer to that is no or yes, so you're not asking for any more personal details. But again, in relation to those yes answers, that's just another flag for you, again, not to use as a sword, but as a shield to kind of say, okay, well, maybe we just want to make sure we know how they're working, how they're set up. Is there anything further we can do to support that individual? Again, back to the InfoSec training, one thing that's always on the slides we have is, don't go to a coffee shop and have a confidential conversation. But of course, if we're living in our homes and sharing our space, we could be having confidential conversations all the time. And that in and of itself could present a risk if you have a flatmate or somebody who is actually working at a competitor. So all of those things, again, just give you flags. So if we move to the final slide, I think it's not the final slide, but this is returning to work. Maybe at some point there'll be a glorious day when we all return to the office. But does returning to work actually eliminate the risk? Well, not entirely. It obviously allows us to step back into these defined roles of work person versus home person, which is going to be helpful. I think for most people, especially if you don't have you don't live in a household, going back and having your colleagues around you is going to be hugely beneficial for people's mental health, etc., which, I think most people have suffered a little bit from over the last few months. But it doesn't eliminate your risk. So, you've got to manage your workforce coming back in, and that could be bringing your remote workers back into the office. It could be bringing people back in from furlough. But also, of course, there's going to be natural attrition during this period. People aren't going to stay static. So you're also looking at understanding and knowing who those new folk are that you're hiring. So let's go to one of our poll questions. And the question is, do you think that workers coming back from furlough or into the office generally, but specifically furlough, should be rescreened before recommencing their work? So if you could vote now. Watching this go up and down. We haven't had much change from the resounding no, which was everyone's initial instinct, which is interesting. So I think we'll close the poll there because it is a resounding and overwhelming no. And it's really interesting. And I think it's a real dilemma, isn't it, as to whether or not it is reasonable to rescreen people as they come back from furlough. Furlough shouldn't be seen in any way as being something that people should be looked upon in a negative way when you're returning from furlough, whether or not you're a new employee or you're coming back from furlough within your existing role. But interestingly, of course, there's going to be a whole pile of dead space in somebody's background. Now, you may feel that somebody coming back into your business, especially if they've worked for a really long time for you, you know them well enough. But there are going to be some people who are relatively new that perhaps you don't know. And anyone who doesn't have a screening policy in place already, there is a risk in terms of what that individual's been doing for the last 6 months, or well, actually longer now, isn't it? So I think it's interesting in terms of, should you rescreen people as they come back into the office? You may want to, again, it may come down to whether those individuals actually have high risk roles and access to certain information. So it may be that you see certain roles where it does apply. So your finance roles, people who hold the reputation of a company in their hands or not. But it's an interesting question, I think. So we're going to go to the final slide, if that's okay. And this is our scenario where we'll ask you all to break out into the rooms. Sally, was there something that you wanted to raise?
There's an interesting point that was come up on the chat, which a couple of people were discussing. Question from Charlotte: what about people working from countries other than the one they are employed in? What are the implications of this? If you've got time, so if you had a point on it.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, and it's something we've actually grappled with, because it comes down to sort of, you know, these two things of balancing your risk. So a lot of people, you know, they may be feeling quite isolated and may not actually, you know, they may have come to England, for example, for their job, but their family lives elsewhere. And so from a pastoral perspective, you kind of want to support people to go back to a location that you know, where they feel supported. That's going to bring out the best in them in terms of performance. But quite rightly, where you've got some you know, some jurisdictions are going to have some interesting rules or sort of viewpoints on how they monitor folk. So anyone going back to certain jurisdictions, I'm thinking about places like Russia or, for example, China, where we know that there is a greater sort of government influence over networks and view of those networks. Yes, that data security point is quite interesting. Again, you know, folk will be using VPNs, but, you know, if you're outside of your home country of network and you're trying to, for example, make sure your European data stays within the EU, somebody moving away could actually, you know, cause real issues if they don't log in correctly and use correct VPNs or VDI, virtual desktop environments. There's real risks. And I think somebody's popped something on here about tax as well. Again, really interesting point. If you're living somewhere for over a certain period, will you suddenly start to have to pay tax in that jurisdiction as well as your jurisdiction that you're technically meant to be living in? So I think there's lots and lots of considerations, and it's a real balancing act between trying to look after your teams and give them that pastoral support versus actually creating more problems down the line with them being out of country and potentially being exposed to networks that aren't secure, networks that could be wonky. You know, some jurisdictions, you know, the networks aren't going to be terribly reliable. And then, of course, you know, employee tax implications. So it's something I think that has to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, and potentially extra protocols put in place to deal with the information security piece of it.
Brilliant. Thank you. I've got 5 minutes left, so I'll let you crack on.
Super. Well, there's not going to be much time. So, but anyway, we've got two individuals. I won't read this out because you guys can all read it. But essentially two folks who have both working in the same company. One's in finance, one's in customer service. They have access to data. They were screened at various points. One lives with their family, one lives in a shared house. And based on what we've talked about today, if on your tables for a couple of minutes, you could just discuss which of the employees you would rescreen, if any of them. It may be that you wouldn't, and if you would, why, that would be fantastic. We've got a poll that we'll ask each table to vote on once you've broken out. And then once you come back, we'll see if we've got time to just chat about it. Okay, so hopefully the virtual world will take you back off to your tables. Perfect. So we've cut the chat a little bit short on the basis that we realised that you couldn't see the slides. And we are running really short on time, but hopefully for anyone who did get the detail that was kind of on those slides, and I don't think we've probably got time for that last poll because I'm conscious of time, is that both of those individuals we felt had real sort of pros and cons as to whether or not you would screen them on return to work. They both have lived in a mixed household, so there may be questions that you want to ask of them when they come back. Again, very generic around competitors. Do they live in a household with competitors? Especially because Bob Smith-Smythe works in finance. You might want to have a look at what access rights he's got. He was last screened in 2017, so that's quite some time ago. So you might want to just do a refresh, understand whether he's been under any pressures, etc. And with Bob Smythe-Smith, again, he looks relatively benign there. He was screened pretty recently. But again, he's quite new into the business, and by virtue of his role in customer services, he does have access to some customer information that could be sensitive and confidential. So therefore, again, it's about reviewing and looking at the information that individual has. So if you were going to, on balance, screen one of them rather than the other, possibly A. And you might be able to put some other measures in place in relation to individual number B by actually looking at their access rights and figuring out whether or not they should be able to see as much as they do in their current role as a relatively junior customer service person. So that wraps up what I've got to talk about today. Sally, do we have any time for questions?
One quick one if anybody has got one. If not, I was going to say, well, first of all, thank you very much, Caroline, for that really informative presentation and timely examples. But we've got some networking time now, so you will be sent back into the networking room. Also, throughout the conference, so today and tomorrow, do go and see HireRight and the other partners. They're going to be out on the virtual booths, so they'll be open to conversation. So if there's something that you're interested in, please do go and pick that up with the HireRight team direct.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, and yeah, hopefully get to chat to a few of you in the in our new virtual rooms.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and if you want to return to the networking area, please click on plenary at the top of the screen. That should have you headed back in the right direction.